You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
Can you hear me?
Hello.
Wow, I actually managed to kill the connection by saying hopefully the connection holds up.
Yeah, the power of speech.
Yeah. I do have a question somewhere about consciousness and control. Swapping places. So, starting again, this is Brian Kuan Wood. It's a huge pleasure to be joined by Tony Wood, speaking to us via Skype from an apartment in Mexico City, where he is now doing research. Tony is a writer based in New York who writes mainly on Russia and Latin America. And we thought to speak a bit today, briefly, about his recent text in the March 2019 issue of e-flux Journal, issue number 98, entitled Intrusions, or The Golden Age is Not in Us. And the text focuses on three science fiction scenarios that, for Tony, as he writes, illustrate what we could say are like three different angles on collapses of orders of magnitude, of cosmic orders, of magnitude or great scale. How do these collapses happen in each of them? Hi, Tony.
Hi, Brian. How you doing?
I'm good. So the three science fiction stories that you deal with in your text are, just to inform our listeners, are Samuel Delany's Dahlgren, written in the 1970s in the U.S., the great Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker, which is from also the 70s, from the Soviet Union, and Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy, which was published in the U.S. in the 2010s. And you write in the text that you want to sketch out some connections between the fantasies of otherworldly intrusion and broader systemic forms of malaise within societies that produce them. And just as we begin, Tony, I wanted to ask you how or why did you what brought you to start reading science fiction? What was there something that you were looking for in science fiction, or have you always been a reader of science fiction?
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be on the show or podcast, whatever one calls it. I've been a long-term reader of science fiction. I've always enjoyed reading, and I think generally what appeals to me about it is the capacity for fully imagining an alternative reality, right? That's the standard thing that people say science fiction is able to do. And I enjoy the kind of the conceptual play that involves and the estrangement from our current reality, right? That the removal into another reality allows you to see your own reality differently as well. And there's also just the sheer escapist pleasure of many kinds of science fiction, of just journeying to distant worlds with from the comfort of one's own chair. Mm-hmm. These particular three things, I hadn't actually specifically thought to combine them. It was more that I read the Jeff Vandermeer, for fun when it came out, and I'd seen the Tarkovsky film many years ago. In fact, I've seen it a few times, and it always stayed in my mind. And then quite more recently, I took Samuel Delany's Dahlgren with me on a trip. Actually, it was a trip to Cuba, strangely. And it was possibly that experience of reading this Samuel Delany book, which very much came out of a certain kind of vision of 70s America, but reading it in Cuba, which is this sort of, kind of strange post-socialist or sort of still socialist, not quite planned economy, but certainly has the remnants of that old Soviet system. I think possibly reading Dahlgren in that context made me think back to the Soviet context of Stalker. So maybe those sort of things grew together. And then once I'd been putting together Dahlgren and Stalker, I found myself making connections forward to the present or the more recent stuff of Jeff Vandermeer. So it sort of came about largely fortuitously, I would say, but out of a kind of longer interest in science fiction I have.
I think it can be interesting also to ask you and even to ask ourselves which orders precisely are the ones that are collapsing, because science fiction has this wonderful way of opening this vast imaginary for visualizing or for imagining things that are happening that are oftentimes inexplicable by other means or other forms of critique or observation. But then I felt often reading your text that there is a certain elephant in the room, where there is something that is actually really happening when these three stories are read together. I wonder actually if maybe I'll read the part of the introduction and then ask you. It's in the beginning of the text. You write, "What if this world contained another one? One subgenre of speculative fiction features an uncanny realm in which everyday reality has ominously, irrevocably broken down. At first glance, everything in that other space seems similar to the world we know, but it soon becomes clear that something is wrong. The sun and moon aren't where they should be. The laws of physics are warped. People themselves seem to change. For the time being, the danger is contained within a limited sphere of its own, but since no one in these stories understands how or why this zone of exception managed to insert itself into their world in the first place, they also can't be sure it won't spill over, spreading across the rest of the planet. It could be a benign oddity, but it could also be an apocalypse in a nutshell, which some kind of transgression or mistake or accidental incantation might suddenly crack open. These scenarios all bear what Mark Fisher has described as the marker of the weird, representing as they do the eruption into this world of something from outside. In this subgenre, as in all other kinds of speculative writing, contemporary fears are interwoven with alarms about unfamiliar disasters to come. Worries about alien invasion mix with guilty recognition of our existing faults. At the same time, these fictions stage a more specific epistemological crisis. As Fisher puts it, the arrival of the weird acts as a signal that the concepts and frameworks which we have previously deployed are now obsolete. But there is another bedrock to these stories. Is there another bedrock to these stories? A material or materialist basis on which to read them? I'm very curious how you read, I think you said Dahlgren, in Cuba, or in Cuba or through Cuba.
Yeah, I think part of the experience of reading these particular fictions or thinking about these three things that I'm looking at is that there is a lot of science fiction that obviously unfolds in a very distant, far removed, fantastical reality, other planets, other galaxies, etc. Right? You know, I'm thinking of things like Iain M. Banks or China Miéville or things like that, which seem to be, which are thoroughly imagined different worlds. And what struck me about this particular little subgenre is that it's very much in this world, but there is this area where something has changed. And I think what's especially powerful about these three examples is that it's quite hard to immediately identify what it is that has changed, but something has changed that has had this dramatic effect. And so I was thinking about, and I think, you know, maybe it was also partly the experience of being in Cuba where, you know, everyday life is completely different from a fully capitalist marketized society. But, you know, people are basically the same. They do a lot of the same things. They have the same needs and interests and pleasures, but something is totally different. And so the question really that formed in my mind is, what is the one thing that you need to change to have this huge systemic set of consequences, right? What is the one twist you can give a whole society that will have these amazing knock-on effects? And so I think partly that was my experience of reading Dahlgren is in a lot of ways, it looks like it's very recognizable, right?
Mm.
Someone reading it in the 70s would not think this is an unrecognizable reality. It's just it's a different version of the reality everyone was already living in. And so I was thinking it almost became a puzzle, right? What is the one ingredient that has been, added to or removed from this soup to make it take this sort of apocalyptic shape? I mean, in some ways, it's. I was also thinking while reading these things of Frederick Jameson's work on utopias, right? He has this one very nice statement where, conceptually thinking about utopias, you can start from the idea of what is the one single thing that will have a transformative effect on the world, on imagining an entirely different reality, right? What is the one fundamental change you could make from which all of the others will flow? And he has one example, which is if you were, and this is to transfer utopias into political programs, right? He's thinking the one demand you could make in contemporary capitalist society that would effectively be utopian would be a demand for full employment, right? That is, it's an impossible demand within the current setup. So you'd have to change everything to make that happen. And so I was partly thinking of that, but sort of turned inside out, right? What is the one change you could make that would just bring this thing, falling down about your ears? And in the case of Dahlgren, it's, what is the thing that would make modern American urban life fall apart? And I think in that case, I thought, well, I just noticed that no one is paying any money for anything. No one has a job. No one works. Like the whole sort of mechanism through which that capitalist society reproduces itself has just disappeared.
Right. Maybe I'll read the excerpts from Dahlgren. So you write about Dahlgren. The Dahlgren seems in many ways to collapse together in an exaggerated and fantastical form two of the Western post-war order's biggest crises: the youth and worker rebellions of 1968 and the steady decline of industry from the mid-1970s onward. Bellona, the city in Dahlgren, is both Paris and Detroit, experiencing their two crises as a single otherworldly shock rather than an unfolding sequence of historical developments. The combination is not just a matter of setting or atmosphere, though. It expresses precisely the import of Delaney's dystopia, which is to imagine the crumbling of the Western post-war settlement, not the end of the world, but the end of a world owned and run by a particular set of people. I was remembering, unquote. I was remembering I guess the only time I was in Cuba in 2000, and when I think still it was you could still see the Cuba that was, and I remember having this really uncanny feeling there, because there was no large type, there were no advertisements, and so it was almost like a lunar landscape, simply because there was no text, there was no large text screaming at you from anywhere. It really was a kind of a science fiction, or it really was a kind of otherworldly experience, and it felt great, actually. It makes me think also that the three scenarios that you present in your text are mostly I think they're almost all scenarios where a certain possibility of annihilation or self-annihilation or self-extinction, human self-extinction, is present or just over the horizon. So it seems like it's also, like you say, it's a way of reading a human capacity, human agency for making the right change in exactly the inverted, in the inverse.
Yeah, definitely. I think there is. What the state socialist system that appears in Stalker, and the capitalist system in Dahlgren, and also the Vandermeer, what our contemporary world what they all share is this a commitment to industrialization, right? To industrial modernity as the ultimate goal of human action within both capitalist and state socialist setups, if you like. And that has always had these kind of dark Promethean, there's always been a dark undertone to that whole Promethean project, right? Like, if you go back to kind of Goethe's Faust, where he's covering the planet with canals, or, all of this sort of transformative potential always has that flip side of the potential for this to go wrong, right? To run out of control. There's a very much a kind of Sorcerer's Apprentice dynamic to this.
Right.
And I think, a lot of, you could say that a lot of the early kind of, going back into the literary tradition, right? A lot of Gothic literature is partly about this, right? The nightmares of early industrialization, Frankenstein, all of these things are partly about that dark underside to that whole project.
Right.
And I think early on it was about it might have been more about loss of contact with nature, but as the industrial project moves on, you could imagine that it's more about, the possibility of total annihilation. And that maybe comes about more strongly with the nuclear era, right? And the capacity for annihilation, not as a long process, but, self-annihilation through literally the push of a button. And that's certainly the nightmare that, as a small child, growing up at the tail end of the Cold War era, that was still very much present, right? The sort of the mushroom cloud that will, end us all. I remember being, this is one of the formative political episodes in my childhood. Was I can't remember when it was. I must have been 11 or 12 or something. And there was the campaign for nuclear disarmament had a stall in the street in the small town in the UK where I grew up. And they were selling postcards, and one of them was the film poster for Gone with the Wind, with Ronald Reagan as Clark Gable and Margaret Thatcher in the pose of Maureen O'Hara, and this massive mushroom cloud behind them, and it said Gone with the Wind. And that, that was a kind of very powerful and very present fantasy that is contained within, our reality. So I think that maybe it's the kind of potential for self-annihilation of the human race that has just sort of, gathered pace.
Yeah.
And now it's taken another twist, right, with the sort of scientific consensus that we've entered, something called the Anthropocene, that there is a kind of totally catastrophic reach of human agency. That's certainly present.
Yeah, this is the funny thing with the Southern Reach trilogy, with Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy. You present it as a kind of as almost like a return to nature, or like a re-enchantment of nature, but to the extreme, where you have a kind of like a biological or like ecological anarchy, where human sentience mingles with plant and animal life, but then also the human is not really is kind of overwhelmed by how enchanted nature is, and becomes slowly kind of absorbed into this kind of like sublime biological super system.
Right. And I think one of the powerful things about the Jeff Vandermeer trilogy is that, often, there have been many different kinds of science fiction where humans are transformed against their will into something else, right? That's a very, common trope.
Yeah.
But the Vandermeer book, it's almost as if, the entire human race, right, the entire planet is actually not in control of what's happening. There is someone else is in charge of the experiment, pulling the levers. It's not just one at a time, but the idea is that, this could actually, whatever is in control of this weird zone could actually just, if they wanted to, experiment with us, right? So there's the sense where that one flips the idea of human agency inside out. On one level, it's a fantasy that's produced by the idea of human agency taking over the environment and having this disastrous impact. But in the novel, this gets flipped inside out, I think, to the idea that, humans can just be transformed by someone or something else, and there's just no way you can control the outcome. And the nightmare aspect of that, I think, is that, well, the initial nightmare is you're not in control. You might get killed or turned into some kind of weird hybrid monster without knowing about it. But the real nightmare, I think, that lies behind that is that wouldn't necessarily be such a bad thing from the point of view of the planet or everyone else, or, civilization in large quote marks. Why would it be such a bad thing if every existing human was turned into some, weird hybrid monster? Would that be so bad? Probably not,
Yeah, this is the really interesting point that you make when you end when you close the text, you write, for as we advance even deeper into the Anthropocene, there would seem to be legitimate moral grounds for questioning the logical sequence of human reproduction. It's not obvious, and perhaps never was, that the relentless succession of one generation by another should be preferable to whatever accidents and mutations, chance, or an outside alien will might choose to inflict. Why, in other words, should we assume humankind has any right to decide whether it gets perpetuated, and if it does, in what form? Why should the future mean more of the same? And then just a bit later, you write, in a way, reproduction is also at the core of the dystopias in Dahlgren and Stocker, since consumption and production are likewise geared to the maintenance and continuation of the human world, to the stable and steady replacement of humans by their chosen successors. The intrusions at the heart of all three fictions throw that line out of joint, bend or break it so that whatever rules drive human activity in the present come to seem redundant. Normal service in these weird zones has not just been suspended, but abolished. So then it really, so also this question of another kind of reproduction that does not involve humans as it's quite a radical proposition that you're making, that actually there's some kind of an interesting promise of something in the prospect of a certain kind of self-extinction.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to balance while writing about these three, text and the film, is obviously the idea of narrating this question of self-extinction and of thinking beyond a kind of a world designed for human purposes. It's a very human problem, right? It's in a narrative that's designed for humans to read and to think about. So it's sort of, in a way, the capacity to think about the lack of human agency is itself a kind of human question. So you can never fully escape that human sort of perspective or angle on it. But I mean, I guess one of the other things I was thinking about while writing this is that idea of what would a world not subject to human agency or from which human control has been removed, what would that look like? And I often think about this famous line of Franz Kafka's. I'm trying to remember where it came from. I think it's a conversation with Max Brod where Max Brod says, "Oh, but so you think there is no hope?" And Kafka apparently replied, "Oh, plenty of hope, but not for us." Right. And so this is one of the things I think that is lurking in this whole question of the Anthropocene and climate crisis that I was spurred to think about by the Vandermeer, is that the idea of ecological collapse, of making the planet uninhabitable for ourselves, and of human reproduction being stalled or totally cancelled. I mean, in a way, it's only a problem for the humans, right? But for the rest of the kind of animal life, plant life on the planet, there is no question there, right? That will continue in one form or another. The cockroaches will have a field day. Life will go on. So I think there's a degree to which, the problem of human agency, this seems circular, but the problem of human agency is only a problem for humans. But I think that's more profound than I think people allow, that actually, if you imagine a world not in control of humans, but that's totally fine. That's actually a more radical step and has more radical consequences than perhaps is often allowed for.
It's interesting though, because often it seems like the Anthropocene is used as almost a perverse celebration of the lack of human will, or of the self-destructive capacity of human will. It's almost like we know Engels went to Manchester in the mid-19th century, saw the Industrial Revolution, and saw this is a real horror show for people. So already he saw the kind of self-annihilating possibility of human industry, but then it seems, and of course Marx and Engels had a fine response to it, which leads us well into the 20th century. But then it seems like the era of a certain kind of Anthropocenic consciousness, which of course there are real ecological facts, but then at the same time the era of thinking the Anthropocene does seem to coincide with the collapse of any promise of global communism, right? With the kind of the enclosure over the earth of of a certain, Fukuyama style liberal democracy.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's not an accident that those two things coincide chronologically. I mean, this is a famous sort of thought that it's become much easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right?
Exactly.
And I think
Jameson via Mark Fisher somehow.
Jameson, yeah, I think that's right. Yeah,
Yep.
I think there is a real political problem, I think, embedded in the idea of the Anthropocene and behind the undoubted, scientific facts, which is the problem of what one does about it, right? And the risk with, I understand there's a lot of climate scientists who emphasize the catastrophic dimensions of this in an attempt to make something happen, and that's totally understandable as an impulse. But there is a risk in any kind of catastrophist, politics, that it doesn't. They're not necessarily very constructive, and the problem with ringing the alarm bell and insisting on anything being an emergency is that actually there's a sense in which that very naturally brings forth a sort of a response of denial, right?
Exactly.
And that's what most of the world is engaged in. That inertially, why should we change anything? And there is a kind of obviously very well-funded denialist lobby denying the actual facts. But there's also, I think, on a deeper kind of systemic level, a denial of the need for change and the capacity to do. In a sense, the more catastrophist you get, the more pointless it seems to try and attempt to do anything about it.
Yeah.
And then that's, I think, the sort of impasse we're in, is that incrementalist solutions to the problem are not going to do anything. But on the other hand, we're really not in a political moment where one can, enact systemic change very straightforwardly. But I think there is maybe, this is something people have also been working on a lot, and is returning to, earlier traditions of ecological thought, right? And looking at, very early on in industrialization, there were kind of ecological visions and sort of ideas of sustainability. I mean, this is something that's, there's a strong strand in the anarchist tradition. Geographers like Élisée Reclus and Kropotkin were also all about, they thought a lot about nature, actually. And some of this is also embedded in the Marxist tradition in corners that people for a long time neglected. So there are kind of resources for thinking about, how to make the kind of the drive to industrialization and development, how to balance that and how to make it cohabit with a more kind of sustainable ecological model, I think. And so it makes sense that people would return to that. I guess the other thing that I would say about the Anthropocene, it's, you're right, in terms of it being a kind of perverse celebration of human agency. There's an extent to which it's a kind of look how bad we've been, right? There's a kind of self-punishing emotional dynamic to it, which obviously some, is in tune with some people's psyches and very much out of tune with other people's psyches. And so I think that's another aspect. The kind of affective dimension of the kind of Anthropocene politics is also something that needs attending to. And in some ways the most constructive, I mean, I've only dabbled in this. I can't claim to any real expertise on it, but the most interesting things I've read really are not about emphasizing the kind of catastrophic dimensions, but about emphasizing the fact that climate change is something we are going to live with. And the question is, there's a series of choices to be made about how we live with it, what we do, what kind of system we put in place, given this new reality. And I think treating it as a given somehow seems more politically constructive to me than the kind of catastrophist idea of somehow either preventing it or it being too late to prevent it. Like, I think neither of those avenues seems very productive to me.
Yeah. So as a closing question, I wonder, maybe even in a kind of a science fiction mode, if we do sort of put ourselves in the position of thinking this kind of slow retirement of the human, kind of not as a bad thing, but as a touch of modesty. What do you imagine that industry and or daily life would start to look like, would start to feel like in this scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I think this probably just comes from my own convictions, but I feel like it all comes down to the need to abolish capitalism. There is this drive towards 2% compound growth that it is a requirement of the current model of economic relations that we have, and that it's not essential. I mean, one has yet to see a kind of fully imagined, successful, egalitarian mode of social life, that works well. But I think, one thing is a very straightforward and obvious fact, but it seems to get forgotten, is that, where planned economies were tried, these were in countries that were still attempting to industrialize and had not yet reached the levels of prosperity that, the Western industrialized world had reached. So they were starting from a very low base and had to reach a higher one in order to make any of socialism's goals thinkable. And obviously when, Marx and Engels and all of the European socialist tradition were writing and thinking about what socialism would look like, it was always on the basis of advancing from the current level of capitalist prosperity. And so if you think that, the platform is not, I don't know, like rural China or, the Russian peasant commune, if you're thinking the basis for achieving a new system would be what we have now, then it becomes much more a question of distribution, and much more a question of how you gear the economy to, how you accommodate people's differential desires, differential needs, differential inputs. I mean, to return to a different science fiction sort of narrative I read, I guess, a couple of years ago. There's a very nice touch in it. This is a novel by Kim Stanley Robinson called 2312, and it's in a distant, although not that distant, future in which interplanetary travel has happened. All of the planets in the immediate solar system and beyond have been colonized, but everything has been organized so that everyone's basic needs are met. Right? There's a system of distribution of all of the material wealth that each of these planets has. Everyone's basic needs are met. What they then do with their lives is up to them. But what the nice touch I like in this is that on one of these planets there are some people who do capitalism, but it's like a hobby. Right. So it's like gambling. Like, your basic needs are catered for. If you want to then go to the casino and be a capitalist, that's fine. The rest of us can, go fishing in the afternoon or go and write poetry in the evening. And so I think maybe what's required is actually, often the idea of a transition out of capitalism is seen as this very utopian breakthrough in which you have to fully abolish capitalism. But I wonder if there's some mileage in thinking about just reducing the scale and importance of capitalism, of the profit motive, of the people's interest in being entrepreneurial and making money. You don't necessarily have to engineer that out of human nature or abolish it or criminalize it or, whatever it is. What if you just make it not that important, right?
So you seem to be suggesting kind of following Jameson or inverting Jameson. Then it's almost like saying that imagining, in some sense, imagining the end of the world could actually be a step towards imagining the end of capitalism.
Yes, definitely. You imagine the end of the world, and then you imagine, that capitalism is just, a subordinate aspect of the continuation of life, right? That you just make it not make any difference what people do for a living, essentially.
Right. Well, on that note, Tony, thank
you.
Thanks for being with us today.
No, my pleasure. Thanks. It was great fun talking about this stuff.
Yeah.